The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the parchment thick and creamy, sealed with a crest that sent a tremor of apprehension through Lady Elara Vance's already frayed composure. It was the crest of the Duke of Blackwood, a wolf's head snarling in black wax, a sigil as formidable and unyielding as the man himself. Her father, his face a mask of weary desperation, had summoned her to his study, the air thick with the scent of old leather and financial ruin. The ledgers lay open on his desk like wounded soldiers, a testament to a battle long lost. "Elara," he began, his voice raspy, avoiding her gaze, "you are aware of our predicament." Elara was aware. She had been aware for months, in the thinning of the household staff, the sale of her mother's favorite mare, the quiet, creeping chill of poverty that seeped through the cracks of their ancestral home, Linwood Hall. They were landed, titled, but utterly destitute. The Vance name, once a sturdy oak, was now a hollow reed, ready to snap in the slightest wind. "The Duke of Blackwood has made an offer," her father continued, finally lifting his eyes. They were filled with a shame so profound it made her own heart ache. "A marriage contract." The name fell into the silence of the room like a stone into a deep well. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, a man spoken of only in whispers, a figure of grim fascination among the ton. He was impossibly wealthy, powerful, and since the tragic death of his young wife some 7 years prior, a recluse. Stories clung to him like graveyard mist. That he was cruel, that his heart had turned to granite, that his manor was a place of perpetual mourning from which no laughter ever escaped. He had not attended a London season in years, and the only glimpses society caught of him were of a dark, imposing figure riding across his vast, unwelcoming estates. "He requires a duchess," her father explained, his words clipped and precise, as if detailing a business transaction, and, Elara supposed, that is precisely what it was. Someone of good breeding and unimpeachable reputation to manage his household and to provide an heir. The final words hung in the air, clinical and cold. An heir. She was to be a vessel, a broodmare traded for the salvation of her family's name. A wave of nausea washed over her, but she held herself rigid, her spine straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had been raised to be a lady, and ladies did not show weakness. They endured. "And in return?" she asked, her voice a quiet thread of sound. "He will settle all our debts, every last one. Linwood will be secured. Your brother's commission will be purchased. We will be saved." Saved? It sounded more like a sentence. To be shackled to a man whose heart was a tomb, to live in a house of shadows, to bear a child for a stranger who would look at her with eyes of ice. She thought of the life she had once imagined, a modest but happy marriage to a country gentleman, a home filled with warmth and affection, the simple joys of a shared life. All of it dissolved now, a watercolor painting left out in the rain. Her gaze drifted to the window, to the sprawling gardens her mother had so lovingly tended. The roses were in bloom, their vibrant reds and pinks a stark contrast to the grey finality settling over her future. This was her duty, to her father, whose health was failing under the strain, to her younger brother, whose future depended on this sacrifice, to the memory of her mother, who had loved this house and this family with every fiber of her being. Her own happiness was a luxury she could no longer afford. "I will do it," she said, the words tasting of ash. Her father let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of such profound relief that it was like a knife in her chest. He did not see the sacrifice, he saw only the solution. He saw the wolf at the door being driven back by the far greater, more dangerous wolf to whom he was now feeding his daughter. The meeting was arranged for the following week, not at a society gathering, not over tea in a polite drawing room, but in the cold, impersonal office of the Duke's London solicitor. The room was panelled in dark wood and smelled of dust and law. Elara wore her best dress, a simple gown of pale blue muslin that suddenly felt childish and inadequate. She sat beside her father, her back ramrod straight, her gloved hands gripping a reticule that held nothing of value. The door opened, and the Duke of Blackwood entered. The whispered rumors had not done him justice. He was taller than she had imagined, broad-shouldered and dressed in immaculate, severe black. His hair was the color of a raven's wing, and his face was all sharp angles and stark planes, a face that looked as if it had been carved from unforgiving stone. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a startling glacial grey, and they held no warmth, no light, no hint of feeling whatsoever. They were the eyes of a man who had locked the door on his own soul and thrown away the key. He inclined his head a fraction of an inch in their direction, a gesture so curt it was more an insult than a greeting. He did not sit. He stood before the hearth, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece, dominating the room with his sheer presence. "Lord Vance?" he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very air. It was a voice accustomed to command, devoid of pleasantry. He turned his gaze upon Ilara, and she felt it like a physical touch, a cold draught that raised the fine hairs on her arms. He assessed her as one might assess livestock, his eyes sweeping over her from head to toe, clinical and detached. She felt a hot flush of humiliation, but met his gaze without flinching. "Lady Ilara," he stated, not as a greeting, but as a confirmation of fact. The solicitor, a small, nervous man, began to shuffle papers. "Your Grace, Lord Vance, if we might proceed with the terms—" "I will state the terms myself," the Duke cut in, his voice sharp enough to slice through the solicitor's fumbling. He did not take his eyes off Ilara. "I trust your father has explained the nature of this arrangement." "He has, Your Grace," Ilara replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "Good, let there be no misapprehensions between us. This is not a union of hearts. It is a contract of mutual convenience. Your family is in need of financial rescue. I am in need of a duchess. You will manage my households, act as hostess when required, and you will provide me with a son. In return, the Vance debts will be cleared, and you will be afforded all the respect and material comfort due your station. Your personal life will be your own, provided it does not bring scandal upon my name. You will find my life is also my own. I require neither your companionship nor your affection. I expect your discretion and your obedience. Is that understood?" Each word was a perfectly polished stone, hurled with deliberate force. He was building a wall between them, brick by icy brick, ensuring she knew her place from the very outset. She was a function, a role to be filled. "Perfectly, Your Grace," she managed to say, her throat tight. He gave a slight dismissive nod. "I find sentimentality to be a tiresome and inefficient indulgence. You will be my duchess, in name and in duty. You are a means to an end, Lady Ilara. Nothing more. Do not delude yourself into thinking otherwise." The words were the cruelest blow of all, delivered with an unnerving calm that made them all the more devastating. A means to an end, he was stripping away her humanity, reducing her to a mere instrument for his dynastic ambitions. She felt a spark of defiance flicker within her, a refusal to be so easily dismissed. She was more than that. She was Ilara Vance, and though she was being sold, she would not allow her spirit to be part of the bargain. She rose from her chair, her movements fluid and graceful, a stark contrast to his rigid stillness. She met his cold grey eyes with her own, which were the color of warm honey. "And you, Your Grace," she said, her voice soft but clear, "are the means to my family's survival. It seems we are well matched in our purpose. I accept your terms." For the briefest of moments, something flickered in the depths of his eyes. Not surprise, perhaps, but a flicker of something. An acknowledgement, maybe, that the object he was purchasing had a voice of its own. Then it was gone, the shutters pulled down once more, leaving only the cold, flat emptiness. He gave another curt nod, this one directed at the solicitor. "Draw up the papers. The wedding will be in a fortnight, a private ceremony." And with that he turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a silence more profound and chilling than any words could ever be. Ilara sank back into her chair, the adrenaline fading, leaving her feeling hollowed out and terrifyingly alone. She had made her bargain. She was to be the Duchess of Blackwood, and her life, as she had known it, was over. The wolf had claimed her. The wedding was, as he had promised, private, cold, and utterly devoid of joy. It took place in the Duke's London townhouse, in a dusty chapel that felt more like a mausoleum. Ilara wore a gown of heavy ivory silk, a dress that felt more like a shroud. Her only attendants were her weeping mother and a grim-faced aunt. Alistair stood at the altar, a towering figure in black, his face impassive. He spoke his vows in that same low, controlled voice, the words of love and honor sounding like a bitter mockery on his lips. When he slid the heavy gold band onto her finger, his touch was cold and brief, the contact lasting no longer than strictly necessary. There was no kiss. He simply took her arm, his grip firm and impersonal, and led her from the chapel. She was now the Duchess of Blackwood. She was his wife. The journey to Blackwood Manor was undertaken in silence. They sat opposite each other in the cavernous ducal carriage, the rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves and the creak of the leather suspension the only sounds between them. Alistair stared out the window, his profile etched against the darkening landscape, a study in brooding indifference. Ilara watched the rolling hills give way to a wilder, more desolate terrain. The trees grew taller and darker, their branches clawing at a sky the color of slate. A fine, persistent drizzle began to fall, tracing sad, silvery paths down the glass. She tried to study him without being obvious, searching for some crack in the formidable armor he wore. His hands, resting on his knee, were large and well-formed, but they were clenched into tight fists, the knuckles white. A small muscle worked in his jaw, a sign of some inner tension he refused to betray. He was a man locked in a prison of his own making, and he had just pulled her inside it with him. What had happened to him? What had extinguished the light in those startling grey eyes and replaced it with such a desolate frost? The death of his wife, of course. But the grief he carried seemed more than grief. It was a living, breathing entity, a malevolent presence that had consumed him whole. As dusk bled into night, the carriage turned off the main road and onto a long, winding drive. Ancient oaks, twisted and gnarled, formed a canopy overhead, plunging them into near-total darkness, and then she saw it. Blackwood Manor. It was not a house, it was a fortress, a great brooding mass of grey stone rising from the mist-shrouded earth. Its countless windows were dark, like vacant eyes staring out into the night. It was a place built to keep the world out, a monument to sorrow and isolation. The carriage shuddered to a halt before the massive front doors. A footman hurried to open the door, and Alistair descended without a word, without a backward glance to see if she followed. Elara gathered her skirts and stepped out into the damp, cold air. The rain had plastered stray curls to her temples, and she shivered, though not entirely from the chill. The doors swung open, and a line of servants stood waiting in the cavernous entrance hall. At their head was a severe-looking woman in a black bombazine dress, her grey hair pulled into a tight, unforgiving bun. Her face was as welcoming as a closed fist. "Mrs. Croft," Alistair said, his voice echoing in the vaulted space. "This is the Duchess." Mrs. Croft, the housekeeper, executed a short, stiff curtsy. "Your Grace," she said, her voice thin and dry as autumn leaves. Her eyes, small and black, raked over Elara with an expression that was not quite disapproval, but something close to it, a weary resignation, as if Elara were just the latest in a long line of inevitable disappointments. "Show her Grace to her rooms," the Duke commanded. He was already shrugging out of his greatcoat, handing it to a footman. "I will be taking supper in my study." He did not look at her. He did not say good night. He simply turned and strode down a long, dark corridor, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor, until they were swallowed by the immense silence of the house. He had brought her to her new home, delivered her like a piece of luggage, and now he was done with her. "This way, Your Grace," Mrs. Croft said, her tone implying that Elara was an inconvenience she was duty-bound to tolerate. Elara followed the housekeeper up a grand, sweeping staircase, her hand trailing on the cold, polished wood of the balustrade. Portraits of Alistair's ancestors watched her pass, their painted eyes seeming to follow her with stern, accusing expressions. They passed countless closed doors, each one a silent testament to the life that was not being lived within these walls. The air was still and cold, heavy with the scent of beeswax and something else, something like old, settled grief. Finally, Mrs. Croft stopped before a set of ornate double doors. "The Duchess's apartments, Your Grace." She pushed them open, revealing a suite of rooms that were opulent, spacious, and utterly soulless. The furniture was heavy and dark, shrouded in dust covers. The vast canopied bed looked as if it had not been slept in for a decade. A film of dust lay over every surface, and the air was stale. These were not her rooms. They were a museum exhibit, the preserved chambers of the first Duchess. "They will need to be aired," Elara said, her voice sounding small in the vastness. "His Grace gave no instructions to prepare them," Mrs. Croft replied, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. It was a subtle power play, a way of reminding Elara that she was an outsider, an unwelcome usurper. "Well, I am giving the instruction. Now, Mrs. Croft," Elara said, her tone gentle but firm, "please have them seen to. I will require a fire and a light supper on a tray." The housekeeper's lips thinned, but she gave a curt nod. "As you wish, Your Grace." Left alone, Elara walked to the tall, mullioned window and pushed it open. The damp night air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. Below, a sprawling, dark shape was just visible in the gloom. A garden, or what was left of one, choked with weeds and tangled overgrowth. The rain fell harder now, a steady, mournful drumming against the ancient stone. It was a perfect reflection of her own heart. She leaned her forehead against the cold glass, a single hot tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. She had survived the arrangement, the wedding, the journey. Now she had to survive the life that followed. And as she stood there, looking out at the darkness that surrounded Blackwood Manor, she had never felt more profoundly and completely alone. In the days that followed, Elara learned the rhythms of her new prison. Blackwood Manor was a world unto itself, governed by silence and shadow. Her husband was a ghost in his own home. She would hear his footsteps in the corridor late at night, or catch a glimpse of his tall frame disappearing into his study, a room she was tacitly forbidden to enter. They took their meals separately, he in his study, she in the cavernous dining hall, a solitary figure at one end of a table that could seat 30. The silence was so complete she could hear the ticking of the great long-case clock in the hall, each second marking another moment of her gilded captivity. The staff, led by the formidable Mrs. Croft, treated her with a cool, formal deference that was a kind of wall in itself. They followed her orders, but without warmth or initiative. They were the Duke's people, loyal to his grief, and she was an interloper, a disruption to their long-established mourning. She felt their eyes on her as she explored the vast, cold rooms, their unspoken judgment hanging in the air. It was during one of these lonely explorations that she made the discovery. She had wandered into the West Wing, a part of the house that seemed even more neglected than the rest. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of sunlight piercing through grimy windows. Here the portraits on the walls were different. They were of a woman with laughing eyes and a cascade of sunny blonde hair, a stark contrast to the grim-faced Beaumont ancestors. In each painting she radiated a vibrant, joyful energy. This must have been her, Isabella, the first Duchess, the woman whose ghost still haunted these halls, whose memory held its master in an unbreakable grip. At the end of the corridor was a smaller door, slightly ajar. Peeking inside, Ilara found herself in what was clearly a child's nursery, but it was a sad, sterile room. A small bed was neatly made in the corner. A few simple wooden toys were arranged on a shelf with mathematical precision, and the air was devoid of any childish clutter or chaos. There was no life here. It was as preserved and untouched as the late Duchess's apartments. A sound from the adjoining room drew her attention. She pushed the door open and found herself in a small schoolroom. A little girl with pale blonde hair sat at a table, her back ramrod straight, a book open before her. Standing over her was a stern-faced woman in grey, a governess whose expression suggested she found children, and this child in particular, a profound irritation. "Head up, Lady Rosalind," the governess snapped. "You are slouching." The little girl flinched and straightened her spine. She could not have been more than 6 or 7 years old, a tiny, fragile creature who looked as though a strong wind might blow her away. She had her mother's fair hair, but her eyes, when she briefly glanced up, were her father's, a startling, solemn grey. "Who are you?" the governess demanded, her eyes narrowing as she saw Ilara in the doorway. "I am the Duchess," Ilara said softly, her heart going out to the small, silent child. So this was the Duke's daughter, another soul locked away in this house of sorrow. She had not even been told of the child's existence. The governess, a Miss Finch, curtsied stiffly. "Your Grace, I was not aware you would be visiting." Her tone made it clear the visit was unwelcome. "I was simply exploring my new home," Ilara said, her gaze fixed on Rosalind, who was staring down at her book again, her small face a perfect blank mask. "Hello, Rosalind." The child did not respond. She did not even look up. "Lady Rosalind is shy," Miss Finch said. "She does not speak much." Ilara suspected it was less shyness and more a carefully cultivated silence, a defense against a world that had offered her no warmth. She saw now the full extent of the tragedy. The Duke, in his all-consuming grief, had not just locked himself away. He had locked his daughter away too, unable to look at the child who was a living reminder of his loss. This, Ilara realized, was a silence she could not tolerate. This was a coldness she had to fight. Her own life might be a matter of quiet endurance, but she would not stand by and watch this little girl fade away into nothing. That afternoon, she sought out the head gardener, an old man named Mr. Abernathy, whose hands were as gnarled as the roots of the ancient oaks. He was tending a small, sad-looking vegetable patch at the back of the estate. She asked him about the overgrown garden she'd seen from her window. His face clouded over. "That's the old Duchess's garden, Your Grace, her rosarium. Hasn't been touched since the day she passed. His Grace had it locked. The keys are in his study. No one is to go in there. A locked garden, a locked heart." The symbolism was almost too perfect. It was a living, breathing metaphor for the entire estate, for the man who ruled it, a place of beauty left to wither and die under the weight of grief. Ilara made a decision. It was a quiet, internal resolution, but it felt like the first real choice she had made since agreeing to this marriage. She would not ask for the keys. She would not ask for permission. She would find her own way in. She would bring that garden back to life. And perhaps, just perhaps, she could do the same for the little girl in the lonely schoolroom. She had been brought here to be a means to an end, to produce an heir. But she would not be merely a passive instrument. She would be a force for life in this house of death. It was a small, secret act of rebellion, a planting of her own roots in this barren soil. And it gave her something she had not felt since her arrival, a flicker of purpose, a reason to face the long, silent days ahead. Ilara began her campaign of quiet insubordination the very next morning. Her first objective was Lady Rosalind. She appeared at the schoolroom door shortly after the morning lessons had begun, a small volume of fairy tales in her hand. Miss Finch looked up, her expression one of pure vinegar. "Your Grace, we are in the middle of our Latin conjugations. Then a short break is in order." Ilara said with a gentle but unassailable smile. She pulled a chair up beside Rosalind, who watched her with wide, wary eyes. The child was like a small woodland creature, poised for flight at the slightest unexpected movement. "I thought we might read a story." Miss Finch opened her mouth to protest, but Ilara's calm authority gave her no room for argument. Ilara began to read, her voice soft and melodic, filling the sterile room with tales of brave knights, enchanted forests, and clever princesses. At first, Rosalind remained stiff and unresponsive, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond Ilara's shoulder, but as the story unfolded, Ilara noticed the child's shoulders relax, almost imperceptibly. A tiny furrow of concentration appeared between her brows. She was listening. Ilara made it a daily ritual. Every morning she would interrupt the grim routine of Miss Finch's tutelage with a story, a game, or simply a quiet moment of companionship. She brought Rosalind a small kitten she had found in the stables, a tiny ball of ginger fur that the girl tentatively stroked with one small finger. She took her for walks in the less wild parts of the grounds, pointing out different birds and flowers. Rosalind remained silent, a little shadow at her side, but Ilara could feel the wall of her solitude beginning to crumble, one grain of sand at a time. Her second objective was the garden. After a thorough search of the estate's outbuildings, she found what she was looking for. A section of the old stone wall surrounding the rosarium that had partially collapsed, hidden behind a thick curtain of ivy. It was just large enough for her to squeeze through. The first time she stepped inside, she felt as though she were entering a forgotten world. It was a scene of magnificent decay. Weeds grew waist-high, strangling everything in their path. Thorny briars snaked across the flagstone paths, and the skeletons of what must have once been magnificent climbing roses clung to a series of rusted iron archways. In the center, a beautiful stone bird bath was choked with moss and black stagnant water. It was a heartbreaking sight, but beneath the chaos, Ilara could see the ghost of what it had been. The structure was still there, the elegant design of the beds, the graceful curve of the paths. It was not dead, only sleeping. She began the work herself, with a pair of old shears and gloves she'd found in a potting shed. It was slow, arduous labor. She tore at the ivy, pulled up the stubborn weeds, and cut back the thorny briars that clawed at her dress and skin. Each evening she returned to the house, exhausted, her hands aching and her gown stained with dirt, but with a deep, satisfying sense of accomplishment. She was not just clearing a garden, she was clearing a space for hope. She knew she was being watched. Sometimes from the corner of her eye she would see a curtain twitch in the window of the Duke's study, which overlooked the garden. He never approached her, he never said a word, but she knew he saw. She wondered what he thought, watching her invade this sacred, sorrowful space, this shrine to his dead wife. Did he feel anger, resentment, or something else entirely? His face, glimpsed from a distance, remained an unreadable mask. One afternoon, as she was wrestling with a particularly stubborn thicket of brambles, a visitor was announced. Lady Beatrice Morley, the Duke's cousin. Ilara had heard of her, a society belle known for her sharp tongue and her even sharper ambition. It was widely rumored that Beatrice had long considered herself the rightful heir to the position of Duchess of Blackwood and had been deeply incensed by Alistair's sudden practical marriage to a provincial unknown. Beatrice swept into the drawing room like a bird of prey, all shimmering silks and flashing jewels. She was beautiful in a hard, polished way with dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She surveyed Ilara with a look of thinly veiled condescension. "So, you are the new little Duchess," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Alistair has kept you well hidden. We were also surprised by the announcement." "It was a private matter, Lady Beatrice," Ilara replied calmly, refusing to be baited. "Of course, Alistair is so very private. He buries everything, doesn't he? His grief, his child, and now, it seems, his wife." Her eyes flickered towards the window in the direction of the garden. "I hear you've taken up an interest in gardening. How very rustic of you." That was Isabella's passion. You know, she adored that garden. It is a shame to see it so neglected, but Alistair will not allow anyone to touch it. He prefers his shrines to remain undisturbed. Every word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to remind Ilara of her status as a replacement, an unwelcome ghost at the feast. "Things left untended do not remain shrines, Lady Beatrice," Ilara said, her voice even. "They simply decay." Beatrice's smile tightened. "A very philosophical view. I am sure you will be a great comfort to my cousin, though I must confess, I do not believe comfort is something he is looking for." She let her gaze wander around the cold, formal drawing room. "Tell me, Duchess, have you found it dreadfully dull here? It is a house with so many locked doors, one must be careful not to get lost." The threat was veiled, but clear. "You do not belong here. You do not know the secrets of this place, and I do." The visit left a bitter taste in Ilara's mouth. Beatrice was a dangerous woman, a rival who saw her as an obstacle to be removed. Ilara knew she would have to be careful, but the woman's venomous words only strengthened her resolve. She would not be intimidated. She would continue her work in the garden and in the nursery. A week later, the first true breakthrough happened. Ilara was sitting with Rosalind on the schoolroom floor, showing her how to make a daisy chain. The kitten was asleep in a patch of sunlight nearby. For a long time, the only sound was the soft rustle of the flowers as Ilara wove them together. She had just completed the chain and was about to place it on Rosalind's head when the little girl looked up at her. Her solemn grey eyes were fixed on Ilara's face, her expression one of intense concentration. Then, in a voice that was small and husky from disuse, she spoke. "It's pretty," she whispered. The two words were so unexpected, so powerful that Ilara's heart seemed to stop in her chest. She stared at the child, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across her face. She felt a rush of triumphant joy so pure it brought tears to her eyes. She had reached her. She had broken through the silence. "Yes, it is," Ilara whispered back, her voice thick with emotion as she gently placed the crown of daisies on the child's pale blonde hair. "It's very pretty. Just like you." Rosalind did not smile, but a faint touch of color rose in her pale cheeks. She reached up a tentative hand and touched one of the delicate white petals. It was a beginning, a fragile, precious seed of connection planted in the desolate soil of Blackwood Manor. And for the first time, Ilara felt that she was not just enduring her new life, she was living it. The change in Rosalind, once begun, was like the slow melting of a frozen stream. It started with a trickle, a whispered word, a fleeting smile, and gradually gained momentum. She began to ask questions, her small voice still hesitant but filled with a burgeoning curiosity about the world Ilara was unfolding for her. She would follow Ilara into the garden, watching with silent fascination as the Duchess cleared away the debris of years, revealing the elegant bones of the rosarium beneath. She even began to laugh, a sound as rare and precious as a diamond, usually at the antics of the ginger kitten, which she had named Sunny. Ilara felt a fierce, protective love for this solemn little girl. In caring for Rosalind, she found a purpose that transcended the cold terms of her marriage contract. This was not a duty, it was a joy. Alistair remained a distant, brooding presence, a storm cloud perpetually on the horizon. Yet, Ilara sensed a shift in his observation of her. The furtive glances from his study window became longer, more direct. He no longer looked through her when they passed in the corridor. Instead, his gaze would linger for a moment, his expression an unreadable mix of something. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but the absolute zero of his indifference had risen by a degree or two. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and rose, Ilara was working late in the garden, trying to free the roots of a particularly tenacious weed from around the base of the bird bath. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear him approach. The thorns of a rambling rose are unforgiving. The low, resonant voice startled her so much she nearly fell backward. She looked up to see the Duke standing on the path, just a few feet away. He was not dressed in his usual severe black, but in a simpler riding coat and boots, as if he had just returned from surveying his estate. The fading light softened the harsh angles of his face, and for the first time she saw not just the cold, remote Duke, but the man beneath, a man who looked profoundly weary. "Your Grace," she said, rising to her feet and brushing the dirt from her hands. "I did not see you." He gestured towards the rose she had been trying to save. "That one is an Isabella, a climbing tea rose. My late wife imported it from France. She said its scent reminded her of summer rain." It was the first time he had ever mentioned his wife's name to her. The words hung in the air between them, intimate and shocking. He spoke them not with the sharp edge of grief, but with a quiet, factual melancholy. He was not sharing a feeling, merely stating a piece of information. Yet it felt like a monumental concession. "It's beautiful," Ilara said softly, looking at the gnarled, neglected canes. "I hope I can save it?" He watched her for a long moment, his grey eyes searching her face. "You have made progress here," he said, the words seeming to cost him some effort. It was not praise, but it was an acknowledgement, a recognition of her labor, of her presence. "It needed tending," she replied simply. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, and then, without another word, turned and walked back toward the house, disappearing into the growing shadows. Ilara remained by the bird bath, her heart beating a little faster. It was the longest conversation they had ever had, no more than a few sentences, but it felt like a chapter. He had seen what she was doing. He had not condemned it. He had, in his own clipped, remote way, acknowledged it. A single, tiny crack had appeared in the wall of ice. The next day brought another small, significant event. Ilara had taken Rosalind to the manor's vast, dusty library in search of a book on British wildflowers. While Ilara was on a ladder, searching the high shelves, Miss Finch appeared in the doorway, her face set in its usual sour lines. "Lady Rosalind, it is time for your deportment lesson," she announced. "You have been idling long enough." Rosalind, who had been happily sketching a picture of Sunny the kitten, visibly shrank. Before Ilara could intervene, a voice came from the far end of the library, where the shadows were deepest. "She will remain here." It was the Duke. He was seated in a deep leather armchair, a book open in his lap, so still and silent that neither of them had noticed him. Miss Finch froze, her mouth agape. Your Grace," she stammered, "but her schedule has changed," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. He did not look up from his book. "The Duchess is overseeing her education for the remainder of the afternoon. You may go." Miss Finch looked as though she had been struck. She shot a venomous glare at Ilara, then curtsied and practically fled from the room. Ilara climbed down from the ladder, her legs feeling slightly unsteady. She looked over at her husband, but his face was obscured by the shadows and the book he held. He had defended her. He had taken her side against the governess, publicly endorsing her role in his daughter's life. It was a subtle but undeniable shift in the household dynamics. He was giving her his sanction, his protection. She led Rosalind to a table by the window, and they spent the next hour looking through the wildflower book. The only sounds, the soft turning of pages, and Rosalind's occasional whispered question. The entire time, Ilara was acutely aware of the silent figure in the corner of the room. He did not speak again, and when she finally looked over, he was gone, having slipped away as silently as he had appeared. But his presence lingered. He was watching, he was aware, and for the first time since her arrival, Ilara felt that perhaps she was not entirely alone in her endeavors. A glimmer of warmth, however faint and distant, had finally penetrated the long, cold winter of Blackwood Manor. The late autumn rains began in earnest, trapping the inhabitants of Blackwood Manor in a world of grey mist and drumming water. The wind howled around the eaves like a hungry wolf, and the ancient house seemed to groan under the assault. It was during this tempestuous siege that the shared challenge Ilara had unknowingly been preparing for finally arrived. It began with a cough, a small dry sound from Rosalind during their afternoon reading. By evening, the cough had deepened, and a feverish heat radiated from the child's small body. Ilara put her to bed immediately, placing a cool cloth on her forehead and sitting by her side, a growing knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. By morning, Rosalind was gravely ill. Her breathing was shallow and ragged, her skin flushed with a dangerous burning heat. She was delirious, tossing and turning, muttering incomprehensible phrases. Ilara sent a groom galloping for the nearest doctor, Dr. Armitage, in the village 10 miles away. But the man returned hours later, his horse lathered and his face grim. A bridge had washed out. The roads were a river of mud. No one could get through. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Ilara's composure. They were utterly isolated, cut off from any help. Mrs. Croft and the other servants were full of dire warnings and useless folk remedies, their whispers of lung fever echoing in the corridors like a death knell. Miss Finch, upon seeing the state of the child, had promptly declared herself susceptible to illness and retired to her room with a bottle of smelling salts. Ilara refused to despair. She had a basic knowledge of herbs and remedies, learned from her mother, and she set to work. She sent a maid to the kitchens for mustard and linseed for a poultice, and another to the still room for dried elderflower and yarrow for a tea to break the fever. She took charge of the sick room, her voice calm and steady, issuing quiet orders that cut through the staff's frightened inertia. For a day and a night, she did not leave Rosalind's side. She bathed the child's face, forced sips of water and tea between her cracked lips, and changed the hot, damp linens. She spoke to her constantly, her voice a low, soothing murmur, telling her stories, singing lullabies, promising her that everything would be all right, even as fear clawed at her own throat. It was late on the second night when the door to the nursery creaked open. Alistair stood on the threshold, a stark, dark silhouette against the flickering candlelight from the hall. He looked as if he had not slept in days. His face was pale and drawn, his grey eyes shadowed with a raw, visceral fear that stripped away his ducal arrogance and left him looking merely like a terrified father. He had been absent until now, a ghost haunting the floors below. Ilara knew he had been receiving hourly reports from Mrs. Croft, but he had not been able to bring himself to cross the threshold of the sick room. Now the child's worsening condition had finally forced him in. He took a few hesitant steps into the room, his gaze fixed on the small, feverish figure in the bed. He looked utterly lost, a powerful man rendered helpless by a force he could not command or control. "How is she?" he asked, his voice rough. "The fever is high," Ilara said, her own voice weary but level. She was wringing out a fresh cloth in a basin of cool water. Her breathing is difficult. We must keep the fever from rising any further. He walked to the side of the bed, opposite Ilara, and looked down at his daughter. A wave of some powerful, agonizing emotion washed over his face. It was not just fear, it was guilt, a profound, soul-deep guilt. He reached out a hand as if to touch Rosalind's forehead, but then let it fall back to his side, his fist clenching. He could not bring himself to make contact. "The doctor," he began. "Cannot get through," Ilara finished for him. "We are on our own." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and she saw in his eyes a desperate plea for reassurance he was too proud to voice. He saw not an inconvenient duchess, not a means to an end, but a woman who was fighting for his daughter's life with a quiet, fierce tenacity. "I have done all I know how to do," she said, meeting his gaze. "Now we can only wait and pray." He did not leave. He pulled a chair from the corner and sat, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands, a silent, tormented vigilante. The hours crawled by, the only sounds were the howling of the wind, the spattering of rain against the window panes, and Rosalind's labored breathing. Ilara continued her work, changing the compresses, moistening the child's lips. He watched her every move, his silence a heavy, palpable thing. It was in the darkest hour, just before dawn, that the crisis came. Rosalind began to convulse, her small body seized by the fever. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. She threw herself forward, holding the child steady, speaking her name, trying to soothe her. "Alistair!" she cried out, her voice sharp with terror. "Help me!" He was at her side in an instant, his paralysis broken by the urgency of her call. "What do I do?" he demanded, his voice raw. "We need to bring the fever down now. The tub. We must put her in cool water." Without a word he strode into the adjoining washroom, and she heard the sound of water sloshing into the small porcelain tub. He returned, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his face grim with determination. He lifted Rosalind from the bed, his movements surprisingly gentle, and carried her to the tub. Ilara followed, her hands shaking as she helped him lower the child into the water. Rosalind's cries were weak and pitiful. Alistair held her, his large hands supporting her small frame, his face a mask of anguish as he watched her suffer. He began to murmur to her, his voice low and broken. "It's all right, little one. I'm here. I'm here." They worked together in a strange, desperate harmony, two strangers bound by a shared fear, the great cold Duke and his convenient Duchess, equals in their powerlessness. The walls between them, so carefully constructed and maintained, dissolved in the face of a challenge that was bigger than pride or grief or the cold terms of a contract. They were simply a man and a woman trying to save a child. After what felt like an eternity, the convulsions subsided. They lifted Rosalind out of the tub, wrapped her in warm, dry blankets, and carried her back to bed. Her breathing was easier, the terrifying flush beginning to recede from her cheeks. She was still frighteningly ill, but the immediate danger had passed. Exhausted, Ilara sank into the chair Alistair had vacated. He stood by the bed, one hand resting protectively on his daughter's sleeping form, his thumb stroking the back of her small hand. The first grey light of dawn was filtering through the window, illuminating the rain-streaked glass. The storm outside was finally breaking. Alistair turned his head and looked at Ilara, his eyes shadowed and deep. "Thank you," he said, the words quiet but imbued with a weight of feeling she had never heard from him before. "I love her," Ilara replied simply, the truth of the statement absolute and undeniable. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in the depths of his eyes she saw the fortress begin to crumble. He looked at her, and for the first time he truly saw her. Not as the Duchess, not as a solution to his problem, but as Ilara, the woman who had stayed, the woman who had fought, the woman who had in the darkest night become his unlikely, indispensable ally. The fever broke with the dawn. Rosalind slept, a deep, healing sleep, her breathing finally even and calm. The rain had softened to a gentle patter, and a watery sunlight was beginning to filter through the clouds, casting long, pale fingers of light across the nursery floor. The air in the room, so recently charged with terror and desperation, was now still and quiet, filled with the profound peace of a battle won. Ilara sat in a chair by the window, her body aching with exhaustion, her mind numb. Alistair had not moved from his post beside the bed. He stood watching his daughter sleep, his face etched with the weary relief of a man who had stared into the abyss and been allowed to step back from the edge. He finally turned from the bed and walked over to the window where she sat. He did not speak for a long time, simply stood beside her, looking out at the rain-washed world. The gardens below were glistening, every leaf and stone washed clean. "She loved the rain," he said, his voice quiet and distant, as if speaking to himself. "Isabella, she said it made the world smell new." Ilara remained silent, sensing that he was on the verge of something, that a door he had kept locked and barred for 7 years was beginning to creak open. "I have never told anyone what happened," he continued. his gaze still fixed on the view outside. And the doctors, the family, they know the facts of it, but they do not know the truth. He took a deep breath, a ragged, unsteady sound. Rosalind was not an easy birth. Isabella was in labor for 2 days. She was a delicate woman for all her vibrant spirit. The doctors were worried. I was terrified. I had never felt so helpless. He fell silent again, and Ilara could almost feel the weight of the memory pressing down on him. She did not prompt him, did not rush him. She simply waited, offering him the gift of her patient silence. Towards the end, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, I became angry. Angry at her, at the child, at God, at my own powerlessness. She was in such pain and I couldn't bear it. I said things, cruel things. I accused her of being weak. I told her to simply finish it. I was a coward, you see, and a brute. Those were the last words she ever heard from me, words of anger, of blame. He finally turned to look at Ilara, and his eyes were filled with a self-loathing so profound it was like a physical wound. The cold, impenetrable mask was gone, and in its place was a raw, devastating agony. She gave me Rosalind, and then she was gone. She slipped away while the doctors were tending to the baby. They said her heart gave out, but I know the truth. I killed her. My cruelty, my weakness, it broke her spirit. And when I looked at that tiny, screaming infant, all I could see was my own unforgivable failure. I saw the price of my sin. The confession spilled out of him, the poison of 7 years of guilt finally finding a release. It all made a terrible, heartbreaking sense now. His coldness, his distance from his daughter, the locked garden, the house shrouded in perpetual mourning. He had not been mourning his wife. He had been doing penance. He had turned Blackwood Manor into his own private hell, a place where he could punish himself for a crime no one else knew he had committed. Rosalind was not just a reminder of his loss, she was a living monument to his perceived guilt. He could not love her because he could not forgive himself. Ilara's heart ached for him, for the years he had lost to this solitary torment, for the little girl who had grown up in the shadow of a grief she could not understand. She rose from her chair and stood before him. She did not offer empty platitudes or easy absolution. She knew that what he needed was not pity, but simple human understanding. You were afraid, she said softly, her voice filled with a compassion that enveloped him like a warm cloak. You were terrified of losing her, and you did not know what to do with that fear, so it turned to anger. It is what fear does sometimes. It does not make you a monster, Alistair. It only makes you a man. She used his given name for the first time, and it felt natural, right? He flinched as if she had touched a raw nerve, his eyes searching hers, looking for the condemnation he so clearly felt he deserved. He found none. He found only a deep, quiet empathy. She would not have wanted this, Ilara continued, gesturing to the silent house, to the life he had built for himself. The woman who loved the rain and planted roses would not have wanted you to live in darkness, and she would never, ever have wanted you to turn away from her daughter. A single tear escaped from his tightly controlled composure and traced a path down his stone-like cheek. He did not wipe it away. He simply stood there, letting her words wash over him, letting the truth of them begin the slow, painful work of cleansing his wounded soul. I don't know how to go back, he whispered, his voice broken. I don't know how to be a father to her. You don't have to go back, Ilara said, her voice gentle but firm. You only have to go forward, and you do not have to do it alone. She reached out and for the first time initiated a touch between them. She laid her hand on his arm, her fingers curling around the tense muscle. His skin was cold, but beneath it she could feel a faint tremor. It was not a gesture of passion, but one of solidarity, of shared humanity. An offer of partnership that went far beyond the cold clauses of their marriage contract. He looked down at her hand on his arm, and then back up to her face. The chasm of grief and guilt that had separated them for so long was still there, but for the first time, a bridge was being built across it. A fragile structure built of shared crisis and quiet compassion, but a bridge nonetheless. In the quiet dawn of the sick room, amidst the wreckage of his past, a new and tentative future was beginning to take shape. The days following Rosalind's recovery marked a sea change at Blackwood Manor. It was as if the storm had washed away not only the grime from the stones, but also the suffocating pall of grief that had clung to the house for so long. The change was most evident in Alistair. The crushing weight of his confession seemed to have lifted something fundamental from his shoulders. He was still quiet, still reserved, but the aggressive, defensive coldness had begun to recede, replaced by a tentative watchfulness. He began to take his evening meals with Ilara in the main dining hall. The long, polished table no longer felt like a vast, empty expanse between them. The silence was different too. It was no longer a weapon or a wall, but a comfortable space, punctuated by the small domestic sounds of a shared meal. He would ask her about her day, about her progress in the garden, his questions brief and to the point but genuine. He was, in his own cautious way, getting to know her. His most significant effort, however, was directed at Rosalind. Guided by Ilara's gentle encouragement, he began to visit the nursery each day. At first he was stiff and awkward, a stranger in his own daughter's life. He would stand in the doorway, watching as Ilara read to Rosalind, his expression a mixture of longing and fear. Ilara became the bridge between them. "Rosalind, dear, would you show your father the picture you drew of Sunny?" she would say, her tone light and casual. Rosalind, shy but trusting of Ilara, would hold up her drawing. Alistair would walk over, his movements slow, and look at the childish sketch. "He has very orange ears," he would comment, his attempt at conversation stilted but real, and Rosalind, seeing her formidable father attempt to enter her world, would offer a tiny, hesitant smile. One afternoon, Ilara found them in the library. Alistair was sitting on the floor, a sight so unexpected it made her stop in her tracks, solemnly helping Rosalind build a tower of wooden blocks. The tower was crooked and precarious, and Alistair's large, capable hands looked comically oversized next to the small blocks. He was completely absorbed in the task, a look of intense concentration on his face. When the tower inevitably collapsed, Rosalind let out a peal of delighted laughter, and Alistair, looking at his laughing daughter, smiled. It was not the tight, humorless line she was used to, but a genuine small smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and momentarily chasing away the shadows. Seeing that unguarded moment of connection, Ilara felt her heart swell with a feeling so warm and powerful it almost took her breath away. She backed away silently, leaving them to their nascent bond, feeling like a gardener who, after long and patient toil, sees the first miraculous bloom. Her own relationship with Alistair was also changing, evolving into something she could not have imagined. One evening, as they sat before the fire in the drawing room, a new and comfortable ritual, he looked over at her. "The Isabella rose," he said, breaking a long silence. "The one in the garden. It has buds." "Yes," she said, smiling. "I think it will survive." "You have a gift for bringing things back to life, Ilara," he said, his voice low. He used her name easily now. "The garden, Rosalind." He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. "Me." He rose from his chair and walked to a small, locked secretary desk in the corner of the room. He unlocked it and took out a small velvet-covered box. He brought it to her and held it out. "These were hers," he said. "Isabella's. I think she would have wanted you to have them." Ilara opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded silk, was a breathtaking necklace of sapphires and diamonds glowing in the firelight. It was a queen's ransom, a magnificent piece of jewelry, but it was more than that. It was a passing of the torch, an acknowledgement of her place in this house, not as a usurper but as a rightful successor. It was an offering of peace from his past to her present. "They're beautiful, Alistair," she whispered, deeply moved. "But I cannot—" "Please," he said, his voice soft but insistent. He took the necklace from the box, his fingers brushing against hers. The touch was warm, no longer the brief, cold contact of their wedding day, but a lingering touch that sent a shiver through her. He moved to stand behind her chair. "Allow me!" She turned her head, lifting her hair as he fastened the clasp at her neck. The jewels were cool against her skin, but his fingers, fumbling slightly with the delicate mechanism, were warm and gentle. For a long moment after the clasp was fastened, his hands rested on her shoulders. She could feel the heat of him through the fabric of her dress, could smell the faint, clean scent of sandalwood and winter air that clung to him. She closed her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with a tension that was entirely new. He finally let his hands drop and moved back to the fireplace. When she looked at him, his face was in shadow, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. The foundation of their relationship, that cold, hard contract, had been irrevocably shaken. In its place, something new and fragile and intensely powerful was beginning to grow. Weeks later, he found her in the garden. Spring had arrived at Blackwood, and the rosarium was a riot of color and life. The Isabella rose was covered in fragrant, creamy blossoms, its canes climbing triumphantly up the restored trellis. Ilara was on her knees, tending to a bed of lavender, her face smudged with dirt and her heart full. Alistair walked down the newly cleared flagstone path, not with his usual stiff formality, but with an easy, confident stride. He stopped beside her, looking around at the transformation she had wrought. "Isabella would have loved this," he said. There was no pain in his voice now, only a gentle, wistful acceptance. "She would have loved what you've done." He looked down at her. "I love what you've done." He knelt beside her on the soft earth, taking her dirt-smudged hand in his. He turned it over, his thumb tracing the calluses on her palm. "These are not the hands of a duchess," he said softly. "They are the hands of a gardener," she replied, her voice a little breathless. "They are the hands of the woman who saved me," he corrected her, his grey eyes, now the color of a warm summer storm cloud, holding hers. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She leaned toward him, her eyes fluttering closed as his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of passion, but of profound gratitude and deep, burgeoning affection. It was tentative at first, a question, and then, as she responded, it deepened, becoming a promise of a new season, a new beginning, born from the ashes of an old sorrow. It was a kiss that sealed not a contract, but a connection, a turning point that marked the end of the long winter and the true arrival of spring at Blackwood Manor. The summons arrived like a missive from another world. A crisp, gilt-edged invitation to a ball at the palace, a command performance they could not ignore. For Alistair, it signaled an end to his self-imposed exile. For Ilara, it was a source of quiet dread. She had grown accustomed to the sheltered peace of Blackwood. The thought of facing the prying eyes and sharp tongues of the London ton was daunting, and she knew that one person in particular would be watching with malicious intent, Lady Beatrice Morley. Beatrice had not been seen at Blackwood since Rosalind's illness, but Ilara knew she had been receiving reports, the whispers of the Duke's transformation, of his newfound devotion to his daughter, and his quiet companionship with his wife would have reached her, and they would have felt like a declaration of war. The journey to London was a world away from their first silent, miserable trip. This time Rosalind was with them, chattering excitedly about the sights of the city, her face pressed against the carriage window. Alistair sat beside Ilara, his presence a warm, reassuring comfort. He would occasionally catch her eye and offer a small, private smile, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had come. Their London townhouse, once a place of cold transactions, had been aired and filled with flowers at Ilara's direction. It felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home. Yet, as the night of the ball approached, Ilara's anxiety grew. She stood before the mirror in her chambers, dressed in a gown of deep sapphire silk that matched the necklace Alistair had given her. The jewels felt heavy around her neck, a symbol of a position she still felt insecure in. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, but in the eyes of the world, she was still the penniless country girl who had snared a great prize. Alistair came to stand behind her, his reflection appearing next to hers in the glass. He was magnificent in his formal evening attire, the severe black accentuating his height and the breadth of his shoulders. He placed his hands on her arms, his gaze meeting hers in the mirror. "You look beautiful, Ilara," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I'm nervous," she confessed. "They will all be staring, judging." "Let them stare," he said, his grip tightening slightly. "You have nothing to fear from them. You are my wife." The words, once a simple statement of legal fact, now held a wealth of meaning. "You are mine, and I am yours. We face this together." He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her bare shoulder, a gesture of intimacy and possession that sent a bolt of warmth through her. Bolstered by his confidence, she took a deep breath and allowed him to lead her to the waiting carriage. The ballroom was a dazzling, overwhelming assault on the senses. 1,000 flickering candles, the soaring notes of a string orchestra, a kaleidoscope of colorful silks and glittering jewels, and the noise, the constant buzzing hum of gossip. As they were announced, a wave of whispers followed in their wake. Ilara could feel hundreds of eyes on them, curious, envious, and critical. She kept her head held high, her hand resting lightly on Alistair's arm, his solid presence her anchor in this swirling sea of society. For the first hour, he did not leave her side. He introduced her to ministers and ambassadors, his tone leaving no doubt as to her status and his pride in her. But eventually he was drawn away by a summons from the king, leaving Ilara to navigate the treacherous waters alone. It was then that Beatrice struck. She materialized at Ilara's side, her own gown a venomous shade of green, her smile as sharp as broken glass. "Well, well, the little country mouse, all dressed up for the ball," she purred, her voice low enough for only those nearby to hear. "You've done wonders with Alistair, I'll grant you that. Tamed the beast, have you? Or was it all a very clever performance, playing the saintly nursemaid to the poor neglected child? A brilliant strategy. It's a shame your own background is not quite so pristine." Ilara's blood ran cold. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," Beatrice hissed, her eyes glittering with malice. "I have friends near Linwood Hall, you know. They tell the most interesting stories about a certain young lady and her rather familiar relationship with her handsome riding instructor. Before her great marriage, of course. One wonders what the Duke would think if he knew his precious, pure bride was not quite the untouched flower he believed he was getting." The accusation was a complete fabrication. a vicious, poisonous lie designed to shatter her composure and ruin her reputation. The riding instructor was a man of 60 with a wife and 7 children, but in a world that thrived on scandal, the truth hardly mattered. A few well-placed whispers were all it would take. Ilara could see the people nearby straining to listen, their faces alight with cruel interest. She felt a wave of dizziness, the room seeming to tilt around her. She had endured so much to find this fragile happiness, and now this woman was trying to tear it all down with a petty, baseless rumor. "You are mistaken, Lady Beatrice," Ilara said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts. "Am I?" Beatrice's smile widened. "Let's ask the company, shall we?" She raised her voice, drawing the attention of their entire circle. "Duchess, I was just asking about your life back home. You must tell us, whatever became of that charming riding master, Mr. O'Connell? I hear you two were inseparable." The trap was sprung. The surrounding lords and ladies looked on with rapt attention, smelling blood in the water. Ilara stood frozen, cornered and humiliated, the lie hanging in the air like a foul poison. And then Alistair was there. He moved through the crowd with a silent, lethal grace, his face a thunderous mask of cold fury. He came to stand beside Ilara, his arms sliding protectively around her waist, pulling her against his side. He did not even glance at the other guests. His glacial grey eyes were fixed on his cousin, and the temperature around them seemed to drop by 20 degrees. "Beatrice," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, a low growl that cut through the chatter like a blade. "You will be silent. You will leave this ballroom, and you will not speak to my wife again. Ever." Beatrice paled, the triumphant smirk wiped from her face by the sheer, unadulterated menace in his voice. She had miscalculated. She had thought to wound the meek little Duchess, but she had instead roused the sleeping wolf, and he was ready to tear her throat out. She stammered something incoherent, curtsied awkwardly, and fled, her retreat a public and undeniable defeat. A hush had fallen over the crowd. Everyone was staring, waiting to see what the formidable Duke of Blackwood would do next. Alistair ignored them all. He turned his full attention to Ilara, his expression softening as he looked at her pale, stricken face. He gently brushed a stray curl from her temple, his touch a public act of tenderness that was more shocking to the onlookers than his anger had been. Then he turned to face the assembled court. He raised his voice, not shouting, but pitching it so that it carried with absolute authority through the suddenly silent ballroom. "You see before you," he began, his voice resonant with a pride and passion that stunned his audience into stillness, "Ilara Beaumont, the Duchess of Blackwood." He paused, his grip tightening on her waist, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. "She is a woman of more grace, compassion, and integrity than anyone in this room. She brought light into my home when it was filled with darkness. She gave my daughter back a father, and she gave that father back his soul." He turned to look down at her then, and the love in his eyes was so clear, so profound, that Ilara's heart felt it might burst. The entire world fell away, leaving only the two of them, standing together in the center of the glittering room. "She is not merely a duchess," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. "She is my wife, the best part of my life, and any who dare to disrespect her, answer to me." It was a speech that would be repeated in every drawing-room in London for months to come. It was a complete and utter repudiation of their cold, practical beginning. It was a fierce, public defense. But more than that, it was a declaration of love, shouted from the highest echelon of society for all the world to hear. He had stood in court and called her his wife, and in doing so had given her not just his name and his protection, but all of his heart. The year that followed was one of quiet joy, of a happiness so deep and steady, it felt as if it had always been there. The transformation of Blackwood Manor was complete. Sunlight now streamed through the tall windows, no longer seeming to fight against the gloom, but to be welcomed by it. The halls, once oppressively silent, were now often filled with the sound of Rosalind's laughter, a sound that Alistair confessed was the sweetest music he had ever heard. The West Wing was no longer a sealed-off shrine to the past. Its doors were thrown open, and the portraits of Isabella now smiled down on a house that was no longer mourning but living. Ilara found her place, not just as the lady of the manor, but as the heart of the family. She and Alistair were true partners in every sense of the word. They governed the vast estate together, his shrewd practicality perfectly complemented by her compassionate wisdom. They raised Rosalind together, a united front of love and gentle guidance that allowed the once silent child to blossom into a bright, confident, and joyful little girl. Lady Beatrice Morley was never seen at Blackwood again. After her public humiliation at the royal ball, She had retreated to the continent, her ambitions for the dukedom permanently thwarted. Her name was never mentioned between Ilara and Alistair. She was a ghost of a past that no longer had any power over them. One perfect afternoon in late summer, Ilara was sitting on a stone bench in the Rosarium. The garden was in its full glory, a testament to her patience and care. The air was heavy with the scent of 100 different blossoms, and the buzz of happy bees was a constant soothing hum. Rosalind was chasing butterflies near the bird bath, her blonde hair flying out behind her, Sunny the cat pouncing at her heels. Alistair came down the path and sat beside Ilara, slipping his arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. He had been in London for a week on ducal business, and she had missed his quiet, steady presence more than she could say. "I detest London," he murmured into her hair. "This is where I belong, with you." She leaned her head against his shoulder, content. "Welcome home." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their daughter play. "Do you remember the day we met?" Alistair asked suddenly, his voice soft. "In the solicitor's office?" Ilara smiled faintly. "How could I forget? You were terrifying." "I was a fool," he said, his voice rough with remembered pain. "A blind, arrogant fool, trapped in my own misery. I said you were a means to an end." He tightened his arm around her. "I have never been more wrong about anything in my entire life. You were not the means to an end, Ilara. You were the beginning of everything." He turned her face to his thumb gently stroking her cheek. The grey eyes that had once been so cold were now filled with a warmth and a love that was hers, and hers alone. "I never thanked you properly," he whispered. "Not just for Rosalind, or for the garden, but for seeing a man worth saving in the ruins of what I had become. For having the courage to plant flowers in a wasteland, for teaching me how to live again." "You saved yourself, Alistair," she replied, her own eyes shining. "You just needed someone to show you that the door to your prison was unlocked. And I needed you to lead me out into the sun," he finished. He leaned in and kissed her, a deep, lingering kiss, filled with the shared memories of their journey, the storms they had weathered, the sorrows they had overcome, and the profound, unshakable love they had built together. It was a kiss that tasted of sunshine and roses, a promise of all the happy seasons yet to come. Rosalind ran up to them then, her cheeks flushed, holding out a fistful of slightly crushed daisies. "For you, Mama," she said, beaming. Ilara accepted the flowers as if they were the rarest of jewels. Alistair reached out and ruffled his daughter's hair, his heart so full of love for the two people before him that he felt it might break its bounds. He had been given a second chance at happiness, a gift he knew he had never deserved, but one he would spend the rest of his life cherishing. Here, in this garden, surrounded by the life and love his wife had cultivated, the Duke of Blackwood was finally completely home. Dear listener, how often do we build walls around our hearts, not out of malice, but out of fear and pain? Like the Duke of Blackwood, we sometimes convince ourselves that emotional distance is a shield, that a life lived in the grey shadows of the past is safer than daring to step into the uncertain sunlight of the future. We lock away the gardens of our own hearts, letting them become overgrown with the weeds of regret and guilt, forgetting the beauty that once bloomed there. Ilara's story is a powerful reminder that the most profound changes often begin not with a grand gesture, but with a quiet, persistent act of compassion. She did not try to tear down the Duke's walls with force. Instead, she simply started tending the neglected garden, both the one of earth and roses, and the one that was his lonely, frightened daughter. She brought life to the forgotten corners of his world, not for praise or reward, but because it was in her nature to nurture. She offered empathy where he expected judgment, and patience where he offered only coldness. Her journey teaches us that we cannot force healing upon another person. We cannot demand that they open their locked doors for us, but what we can do is create a safe, warm space outside that door. We can show through our own steady kindness and unwavering integrity that vulnerability is not a weakness, and that letting someone in is not a risk, but a release. Sometimes the greatest love we can offer is to simply be the person who is willing to wait out the storm with another, holding a candle in the dark, until they are ready to find their own way back to the light. Think about the locked gardens in your own life, or in the lives of those you care about. What small, patient act of tenderness could you perform today? It might be as simple as listening without judgment, offering a hand without being asked, or planting a single seed of hope in a place that has long been barren. Like Ilara, you may discover that in the act of healing others, you find the truest purpose for your own heart, for it is in nurturing life, in all its forms, that we find the deepest and most meaningful connections of all. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story touched your heart, Please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that even the longest winter eventually gives way to spring. Your support allows us to continue bringing stories like this to life. Until next time.